Hi, Misha here, and over the year, Jay has put out quite a few videos on swords and knives. And my counter to that originally was going to be kind of these modeling gun videos, but since I've been here more or less alone all year, it's been hard to do it. But with the new camera, I thought I'd give it a try, and to kind of acknowledge and pay tribute to the recent anniversary of Pearl Harbor, I thought we would kind of look at some of the guns and military hardware at Pearl Harbor. So I've laid out quite a selection here. And I'm also going to be posting a video on my personal channel, just Misha, that's going to have more extended commentary, maybe funny stories or bloopers or outtakes, just more uncut than this. So if you like this, you might check that out. So with that, yeah, what do we have here? Starting with the firearms, looking at what Japan would have been carrying on board the aircraft, we had their very modern Type 94 Nambu pistol, chambered for 8x22 Nambu. This was officially adopted in 1934, but really wasn't put into heavy production until the late 30s, and was especially designed for tight places, like tanks or aircraft. And this gun I picked here was actually made right before Pearl Harbor. But plenty of older Type 26 revolvers were still in service. This is a double action only 9mm revolver that dates back to the 19th century. And even though production was long over, they refurbished some, and that's why I picked this one. You can tell the refurbs easily if they have the wood grips that are slatted like this. And again, they were still very much used. On the American side for firearms, we have, of course, the good old 1911 and 1911A1. I picked this one just to represent. 45 caliber, single action only. And there were many 30 caliber double action revolvers. This one's actually probably not exactly appropriate. I just haven't had it in many videos. This is my Colt so-called Commando. More Smith & Wessons were used, but there are plenty of Colts of different stripes. There were all kinds used, just little 38 revolvers. These were often carried by air crews because they were just simply felt to be safer. On the plane side, there were three main planes that Japan used for the attack, plus there was a reconnaissance plane. For their bomber, or dive bomber, we have the Aichi D3A, an old design by this point, but it was still used throughout the war. For the torpedo bomber, we had the slightly newer Nakajima B5N Kate, often known as the Kate. And I have two versions out because there were two main styles. One carried a Type 91 torpedo. Another one carried a bomb, but interestingly, the bomb was actually made from a battleship's shell, and both were specially modified to work in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. And these were escorted, of course, by the very famous Mitsubishi A6M Naval Type Zero carrier fighter, often called the Zero, by both Allied and Japanese pilots, and codenamed the Zeke. And this was a very cutting-edge fighter for this day and time. In fact, it was the first carrier fighter that could go toe-to-toe with land fighters. On the other hand, America had the Curtiss P40 Warhawk, and early on these would have been versions like the B. Both planes came into service around the same time. However, the A6M was a more remarkable plane, but the P40 ended up being exactly what America needed. and it was also about the only defense they had at Pearl Harbor. And then finally, for the video, to kind of represent the fleet, I have a model of the USS Arizona, one of America's World War I era battleships, or super dreadnoughts. The aircraft models are 1/72 scale diecast, and the ship model is 1/700 scale diecast. So not exactly to scale, but you know, hey. So with that, let's just kind of compare and contrast and talk about what happened at Pearl Harbor. Before we get into the aircraft, let's look at a couple of the newest guns in use of each. Of course, here we have a 1911 A1. Now this one was made later in the war, but it was the standard. And we have the Type 94 Nambu, which was actually quite recently adopted in Japan. So the 1911, you know it, you love it. I'm going to set the camera down and try to do it this way. Be a little easier, I think. Typical blowback gun, locked breech. Seven-round single stack mag. Thumb safety here. Grip safety here. Single action only. Pretty basic sights. And this is the 1911 A1, which was an improvement. First kind of designed in 1924, adopted in 1926. And it's several small but important ergonomic and just user updates, like the arched mainspring housing, an extended beaver tail, altered hammer, more easily visible sights, redesigned shorter trigger with these scallops back here to make it easier. Of course, the original 1911 could be blued. Later in World War II, they would go to phosphating, parkerizing. Originally, they'd have wood grips. Later, they would go to synthetic. This is not a light gun. It's nearly 2.5 pounds unloaded. It's 8 1/4 inches long with a barrel at 5 inches. And again, it fires the 45 ACP cartridge. The Type 94, on the other hand, was an all-new design, first adopted in 1934 and put into production about halfway through 1935. And as I said in the intro, this was designed specifically to, for small. The Type 14 Nambu, which had only been adopted a few years earlier, was quite large. In fact, it was longer than the 1911. So the idea was to have something shorter. It is just over 7 inches long, and it has a 3 3/4 inch barrel. It's also quite a bit lighter than the 1911. It's 1 pound 9 ounces, so about a pound and a half unloaded. It fires the 8x22 bottlenecked cartridge. It is a locked breech, ejects from the top. As you saw, it pulls out to the side. Pretty ergonomic grip, synthetic grip panels. It has a hold open, but when you remove the mag, that's it, because what holds the gun open is the follower. This is a 6-round magazine using a very similar Browning type release. It has a manual safety here. They will overdue if you do it, because these are old. This one's very stiff, which is good. Stiff is good. Lanyard loop back here. Notice it does have a concealed hammer. This is hammer fired, not striker. but it is still single action only. Also, it has a magazine disconnect safety, so if the mag's out, you cannot pull the trigger. These are often derided because you can push it here to activate it. That's really been overstated. For one thing, when the safety's on, you cannot do that. And when the safety's off and there's a round in the chamber, you should be wary of the gun anyway. And Nambu was aware of this. He wasn't an idiot. This was a decision he made to keep it compact and slim. It was also designed to be as economical to produce as possible. It was actually a good gun, believe it or not. The grip is small for us today, perhaps, but it was well suited for its time, kind of like a Glock 26 would be. And this hammer firing system it used was markedly more reliable than the Type 14. But the trade-off was the trigger. The trigger's not terrible in this, but it's nowhere near the Type 14's trigger. It has basic sights, what have you. Like I said, these were put into production in 1935, but they really didn't ramp it up till 1940, and at that time they made a few changes to simplify production, like removing a few machining steps. They also changed the grips. But early guns like this are still high quality. It would not be until World War II that they would really speed up production and quality might dip. And these were only ever built at one factory. Going back to the 1911, in the 1930s, the military was restricted to about 144,000 individuals, and was very ill-equipped when the first threats of war came out in 1936, 1938. There were some crash programs in 1939, 1940, including trying to set up more 1911 manufacturing, because essentially all they had were old World War I guns and a few newer made Colts from the 30s, but that was it. Now, they eventually did set up Remington Rand, Ithaca, but that did not happen until 1942. So, at the time of Pearl Harbor, it was older service 1911s. Some have been updated to 1911A1, some are still the original 1911. But of course, by 1945, they would produce a bunch of these. As for the 94, this was always meant to be a specialist gun. The Type 14 was still the standard sidearm, and they would produce over 250,000 of those. For these, they produced over 70,000, 71, 72,000, give or take. But they were never made in great numbers because they only came out of one factory. I've always had kind of a soft spot for these myself. I think they're just kind of weird and neat, and for a long time they've been underappreciated. So this could have been something that a Zero pilot had strapped to him. However, it was very unlikely that a P40 pilot would have one of these strapped to him for a few reasons. But before we talk about our other guns, let's go back to planes for a bit. So let's begin. The Japanese had 408 aircraft total. And of these, 360 were bombers. Some B5N, some here, the Aichi D3A. The others were the escorting fighters. Now the D3A, codename Val, is a dive bomber, or can be used as a standard bomber. And I have to give credit at the beginning here for having this model. This is from SkyMax, and these are out of production and go for nuts money online. Yeah, it's not just Firearms that go up in value, models do too. And I have this thanks to Pete's Collectibles. He found a couple old stock, one of which he sold for crazy money on eBay. The other one he sold to me at the original early price. So yeah, he absolutely didn't have to do that, or even tell me he had found one. So credit where credit is due. This aircraft looks a little kind of old. We have fixed landing gear. They don't retract. But it is a monowing. This was actually the Japanese Navy's first carrier-based monowing dive bomber. Specs for it dated back to 1936-37, and the first prototype flew in 1938 and sucked, so they had to rework it. The competition was mostly between Aichi and Nakajima to produce it. They improved the wing, a more powerful engine, and therefore in 1939 the Aichi was selected to be the carrier Type 99 bomber. And it entered into carrier trials in 1940, and so was in widespread use by 1941. This is not a fast aircraft. In fact, that's why it has the landing gear fixed. It only can do, in its original variant, about 240 to 250 miles per hour while carrying a payload. And its payload is one 550-pound bomb under the fuselage. And it can also carry two smaller bombs, one on each wing. That's for offense. For defense, it has two 7.7mm machine guns in the front, and it has a third heavy 7.7mm flexible machine gun in the rear. It has a two-seat cockpit with the pilot and then the rear gunner / radio operator. It is, of course, quite big. The wingspan is 47 feet. But it's obviously not built for performance, as you would see. It was built to be a bomber. Now, it was pretty successful, even though it looks obsolete. It sank more Allied ships than any other aircraft type in World War II, so credit where credit's due. And on the day of December 7th, beginning at 7:48 in the morning, it wreaked havoc on Pearl Harbor. Since these were standard bombers, they were primarily tasked with going at ground-based targets, installations, facilities, buildings, although some did go at the ships as well. They would have over 50 in the first and second waves. Some of them didn't take off or make it because of technical issues. But out of the 360 bombers, about 353 did make it to Pearl Harbor. So they did get there. And they did drop their bombs, and they did quite a bit of damage, frankly. But they had the problems of a lot of Japanese aircraft. They were pretty lightly armed and armored, something that was obvious even in 41 and would become more obvious as the war went on. 3 7.7mm guns to defend yourself is not a great deal, and a bomb load of 550 pounds is not huge. But then again, this was a carrier-based aircraft, and so it had to operate with those restrictions. While the concept of a dive bomber was quite new in the 1930s, it had been kind of pioneered by Germany and a few others, the idea of a carrier-based torpedo bomber goes way back. So Japan had them. There was the B3 and the B4, but these were disappointing. So in 1935, they said, we want a new modern attack bomber, as they called it, for carrier use. And that resulted in this aircraft, the B5N, codenamed Kate, sometimes called the Kinko, by Nakajima. It first was ready to fly at the very tail end in 1936, flew in 1937, and it had kind of a head-to-head competition with the Mitsubishi design in 1938. And believe it or not, this was the most modern torpedo bomber in the world at the beginning of World War II, and it was faster than both the TBD Devastator of the USA and the Fairey Swordfish of Great Britain. Probably one of its most modern features were its landing gear. They were retractable. It had folding wings, of course. Early on, they were hydraulic, but later they went to manually folding. And it was reasonably fast for what it was. It could get up to over 230 some odd miles per hour, maybe even bumping 240 with later versions. All while carrying a crew of 3. And an ordnance load double that of the D3A. It could carry either one Type 91 torpedo, like this aircraft has here, which was nearly 1,800 pounds, or it could carry nearly that in bombs. It could carry 2 of the 550-pound bombs, like the D3A would have, or multiple smaller, or it could carry one big old honking bomb. Like I said, nearly 1,800 pounds. It had a wingspan of nearly 51 feet and an overall length of 33 feet. But like most Japanese naval aircraft of this time, it was very lightly armored, and this one in particular was very lightly defended. In the front, it had no guns. In the back, it had one 7.7mm machine gun that was manually reloaded with 97-round drum magazines. So not exactly a blisteringly fast rate of fire. The idea was they would defeat attacking aircraft with speed. But yeah, this worked early on when it first fielded at the end of 1938 in China, when it didn't go up against much opposition, and still did okay in 1940 in other places like formerly French-controlled Indochina. But once America and Britain got into the war, the B5N was already pretty dated. But anyway, this was the torpedo bomber that they used for Pearl Harbor. And they had quite a number of them available. 145. And 90 would be in the first wave. 40 would have torpedoes fitted, like on this model here. And 50 would have an interesting bomb. Now, the ordnance that the B5N carried for Pearl Harbor was specially made and fitted for working in the shallow waters. This one has the bomb that they used, and it was actually a 16-inch naval shell, so from a battleship, essentially, fitted with fins, wooden fins to guide it. Also, the torpedoes had special fins for the shallow water. And while the D3As were primarily assigned for the ground targets, ground installations, the B5Ns, which the first one of these led the attack with the Tora thing, they were assigned to go after the battleships and carriers. They didn't think any were in port, but if they could find one, go for a carrier. And failing that, go for a cruiser. And failing that, then you can go for a ground target. But these are the ones primarily assigned for that duty. And early on, they claimed very good success with their torpedoes. Better than average, for sure. But then again, they were shooting at stationary targets in ports, so there's that. But the majority carried bombs. In fact, the second wave, which was 55 B5Ns, carried, as far as I know, exclusively bombs. And they continued to do pretty good damage. But were lightly armored and lightly defended, so yeah, they did lose several. Early on, the Japanese, the first wave only experienced 9 planes shot down. The second wave, however, experienced 20 shot down. And this was one of the factors that contributed to the fact that they decided not to go for a third wave. They thought, well, if we went from 9 to 20, next time it could be 50 or more because they're getting more and more ready for us. Second, they were running very low on fuel and they were running out of daylight. So the Japanese decided to break off. With that, let's move on and look at the fighters that defended these bombers, as well as tried to keep them from destroying a part of Hawaii. Now on to the fighters. Obviously the P-40 was stationed at Pearl Harbor for defense and whatnot, whereas the A6M Zero had a primary task of escorting and defending the bomber waves, and a secondary task of strafing targets of opportunity with its guns on the ground, be they on like battleships on the deck or, what have you. America had over 400 aircraft at Pearl Harbor, but of course not all, even a majority may not have been, strictly speaking, fighters. And the P-40 was really the only one to put up any kind of resistance. For example, like I said, George Welsh is very famous. Also Taylor from this time. Only a handful were able to get in the sky, but they did shoot down at least half a dozen Japanese aircraft. There were also some older aircraft there, like the P-26 and the P-36, and plenty of reconnaissance. And there were some naval aircraft stationed there too. But the problem was, on the American side, they were mostly parked. It was Sunday morning. They were unattended. They were just out, kind of lined up like ducks. Whereas the Japanese were prepared. So, what about the two fighters that they have here? Interestingly, both were put into full production in 1940. And both had very similar original orders. But both were very different goals. Let's talk about the Curtiss here. This was designed to be a higher performance aircraft than the previous P-36 Hawk. Essentially, they re-engined it and made a few improvements, and that was based on early lessons that France and Britain were learning in the war. So in 1939, the U.S. Army Air Corps put out specifications. They had to tweak it a bit. They changed the engine. They finally ended up with something they were happy with, and they went with the P-40, not because it was a revolutionary better aircraft, but because it wasn't. It was an evolutionary better aircraft. It could be in service a full year earlier than other designs like the XP-39 or XP-38, which eventually would go into service, of course, but it was just enough of an improvement that it was worth doing. It was also very rugged, dependable. It was tested technology, and it performed fine. It was easy to maintain in the field, as they found out. Early in the war, it was very average, but that's not a bad thing because they were able to get it out very quickly. From the prototype flying in 1939 to the first production order for 524, which honestly was the largest single order for aircraft that the U.S. Army Air Corps had ever issued up to that time. By late summer of 1940, already 200 aircraft were ready to go. So hundreds were in service, and that's why they were at Pearl Harbor, as well as eventually equipping units like the Flying Tigers early on. As for the Zero, it was a very ambitious project dating back to 1937. The Japanese Navy required great performance from a carrier aircraft, including range, speed, maneuverability. So much so that only Mitsubishi was willing to take on the challenge. Nakajima just bowed out, as did most other companies. Nevertheless, with many design compromises taken, they did have a prototype flying in 1939, and kind of the early pre-production models, which were actually land-based, the A6M 2A, were first used in China in the summer of 1940. And then with the success of the 2A, they adopted the 2B, the 21, which was the carrier-based version. It had a few adaptations, of course, a tail hook, it had folding wingtips, and it could use a drop tank and a few other improvements. And by the time of Pearl Harbor, December 1941, over 500 were in service, and they had just approved production at additional facilities a month earlier, so they were ramping up to build these in greater numbers. And like I said earlier, this was the first carrier-based aircraft to challenge land-based aircraft. So it was meant to be long-range fighter, whereas actually the P40, before World War II, the U.S. Army Air Corps, kind of viewed fighters, or pursuit planes as they call them then, as more of a close air support, ground support, with fighter as a secondary role. Well, what about specs? Well, the P40 is about 32 feet long with a 37-foot wingspan. The A6M is a little larger, at about 30 foot long, and then has a 39-foot wingspan, again carrier base. Speed-wise, these early versions, the A6M2 and the P40B, are very similar, about 330 to 335 miles per hour max, with cruise ranges a little lower. The P40 does have a slightly better cruise speed than the A6M, but the thing is, with the A6M's cruise, it was more geared towards conserving fuel for that range endurance that a carrier aircraft would need. Altitude-wise, the P40 can get up to about 29,000 feet, whereas the A6M can get up to 33,000 feet, so it kind of bests it there. In terms of maneuverability and all that, the A6M was better at low speeds. It had very good turning and whatnot early in the war. It could outdo the P40, but at higher speeds, the P40 could match it. On the other hand, the P40 was more of a low to medium altitude aircraft. The A6M could do better at higher altitudes. So if you were in a P40, you needed to keep this in mind. Also, the P40's climb was only so-so, but it had a pretty darn good dive for this point in the war. My point is kind of, the A6M had a bit of an edge, but a skilled pilot that knew the weaknesses of the A6M could do well on a P40, even an early version like the B. Speaking of armament, early in the war, the P40 was kind of a little lightly armed. It had 4 50 caliber machine guns. Now later they would add more, but yeah, not grossly outmatched, but not great. It also had only so-so armor, but they did add self-sealing fuel tanks early on in its production, so that's good. Actually, originally they had kind of semi-self-sealing, but yeah. The A6M, as famously known, did not have self-sealing fuel tanks, and this isn't because the Japanese were idiots. This is because they added a great deal of weight and they reduced the fuel, so they made a trade-off. And obviously they didn't have much armor again early on, so the P40 was a more durable aircraft, no question, and it could take a lot more punishment. But the A6M had range and maneuverability and somewhat speed on its side. As far as its armament, it had 2 7.7mm machine guns, so a smaller caliber than a 50, 30 caliber. However, it also had 2 20mm cannon. Now this was a mixed blessing. The cannon obviously could pack a good punch. 20mm is pretty good for early war, but it had a limited ammunition capacity early on, only about 60 rounds per cannon. And because its 2 guns had very different projectiles, the points of impact were very different. So a pilot had to be more thoughtful about what he was doing. And again, early on, the A6M could take a drop tank. It really had to. Whereas fuel tanks were added only later on in the P40. So they were very evenly matched, all things considered, especially considering the P40 would have had a home field advantage, but of course it was a surprise attack, so that was mostly negated. As far as ultimate production, the A6M was the most produced Japanese fighter of the war, with nearly 11,000 built. The P40 was the third most heavily produced fighter of the war, with over 13,700 built. But both were becoming obsolete by 1942. One would be basically replaced in service by newer models, the P47 and of course the famous P51, whereas the other would not. Even though they would make newer versions of the Zero, it was still very much the Navy's primary fighter until the end of the war. They would use the A6M to escort, of course, both waves. The first one had about 36 A6Ms. And the second, about the same. Others were kept back at the carriers to fly cap for defense. And some did go after ground targets in and around Pearl Harbor. Let's move on. Back to the sidearms. So the U.S. had adopted a new version of the 1911 A1. It was ramping up production, but it wasn't there yet. And the Japanese had two automatics, the 14 and the 94, being made at multiple factories. So why did they need old wheel guns? Because even though Japan tried to prepare for war, they didn't expect a long war. And America, even though it was aware war was coming, was still very much stuck in its isolationist phase. So the revolver here is a Type 26, sometimes referred to as a Nambu, but it's not. And like I said, I pulled my Colt Commando out. This is a military issue, but it's actually later on. But it can represent all these 38s that America had during the war. So, setting this down. The Type 26 is named for the 26th year of the reign of the Meiji Emperor, which we know as 1893. Even though this was the year it was adopted, it actually wasn't put into production until 1894, which is common with the Japanese. Same thing happened with the Type 94. It fires a 9mm projectile, rimmed round. It's a little over 2 pounds unloaded. It's about 8.5 inches long, a barrel of about 4 3/4 inches, and it is double action only. I'm not going to snap it because it's old, but you get the idea. There's an exposed hammer, but it doesn't have a spur. Another interesting feature, it is top brake, kind of inspired by, say, a Smith & Wesson. Like that. Top brakes are cool and were popular in the late 19th century, but are not as weak as not as strong as a solid frame. They are weaker. Although this one is still very tight. Very basic sights. Pretty standard. It takes some inspiration from the Austrian Rastgasser, including its side plate, and again the Smith & Wesson. They would produce these in relatively low numbers, beginning in the late 19th century, all the way through World War I, with production ending with the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923, at which time they produced about 60,000. Originally it said these were made for cavalry, but later they were just kind of issued all around, and were the standard gun for World War I. Now for World War II, production was long over, but between 1925 and 1935, they did take older guns, refurbish them, rebluing where necessary, and putting new grips on, like these. These are replacement grips. It's also said they did assemble some new ones from existing leftover parts that were salvaged after the earthquake, but this is debated, but is plausible. So while at the time of World War II they were not being made, they were still very much issued and would be issued throughout the Pacific. It may not have been what a pilot carried, but they were around. And they're just kind of neat and not commonly encountered today. And they were very well made. As for America, even though the 1911 dated back before World War I, the good old revolver never fell out of favor. They would have various versions of the Smith & Wesson M&P military and police purchased over time, as well as the Colt official police, both being chambered for .38 special. And these would roughly be a little over 2 pounds, maybe 2 pound 1 ounce up to about 2 pound 3 ounces, and would commonly have barrels in the 4-inch range, giving an overall length of about 8 inches, 8 1/4, depending on the exact model. Pre-war examples would have a blued finish and would usually have wood grips, nicely checkered. With the wartime, much like with the 1911, they would go to phosphating for the finish and simplified wood grips. This Colt here has synthetic, which is what they used on these. Now, even though these models are newer than the Type 26, they all date back to designs from the late 19th century. For example, the original Smith & Wesson 1899. You know, revolver tech kind of slowed. Now, things that the U.S. revolvers typically had. They had a swing-out cylinder, meaning solid frame, stronger. But, of course, they had to be ejected by hand, unlike the Japanese. They were double and single action with the spur on the hammer. It's worth pointing out that on the firing pin, the early Victory models had a problem, so a firing pin safety had to be added. 6 shots, pretty simple sights on any of them. And these are very much preferred by air crews, both in the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Marines, and even the U.S. Army Air Corps. They were smaller and lighter than a 1911, and they thought they were a safer thing to be carrying on board an aircraft. Plus, you know, use is a little different. That's not to say that 1911s were not issued. They were. That's why they're on the table. But many revolvers, again, especially with naval aviators, were common and preferred. Another part of this is, with 1911 production, the Army got preferential treatment, and the Navy and the Marines were secondary. So early on, yeah, you know who got the goods. They would produce about 50,000 of these so-called Colt Commandos for the U.S. military, and over 350,000 Smith & Wesson M&P/Victory models. So over 400,000 just for the U.S. military were made in World War II, plus many, many more for allies. So yeah, older guns like these were still very much in use during Pearl Harbor. With that, let's get back to some models and the story of December 7 itself. And now to the ships. Of course, we have the USS Arizona, it's the icon of the Pearl Harbor attack and the cost. The Arizona was a member of the Pennsylvania class, which itself was kind of really a subclass of the standard class or standard type. And this was a series of 12 battleships that were ordered before World War I and were commissioned into the U.S. Navy between 1916 and 1923. Now, there were 5 classes or subclasses, and it began with the Nevada class and ended with the Colorado class. But the idea was they could all operate together, so they all had the same top speed, same basic range, same basic turning, and used much of the same stuff. But they did improve them. For example, Nevada had 10 guns, 14-inch. When they came to the Pennsylvanias, they went to 12 14-inch, and when they went to the Colorados, they went to 8 16-inch guns. They also improved the secondary batteries, the engines, just, things like that. Torpedo protection. Armor stayed more or less the same. They used the all-or-nothing armor scheme. So these were World War I era battleships. They were a little over 600 feet long. The Pennsylvanias here had a crew of about 900 officers and men. And the standards had a pretty much universal top speed of 21 knots, give or take. They were oil burning and really didn't see much use in World War I. At the beginning of Arizona's career, this really dates back to a lot of politicking between 1912 and 1914. The Congress didn't want to pay for it, and some thought this was too little, too weak. Others thought that it was too much. Despite all this, Arizona was laid down in 1914 and then commissioned into the fleet at the end of 1916. She started her career off in the Atlantic Fleet, but again, she didn't take part in World War I. After that, though, in the 1920s, she was transferred to the Pacific, because that was pretty much where they figured the next threat would be now that Germany was off the table. Pennsylvania and Arizona would be extensively modernized between 1929 and 1931. They would give her guns better elevation. They would improve her secondary battery. They would improve her boilers. They would improve her torpedo protection. They would remove her torpedo tubes. They would improve her bridge. And originally, the Pacific Fleet was located in San Francisco, but with war looming, President Roosevelt ordered them moved to Pearl Harbor, closer to the potential enemy, Japan. On December 7, 1941, of the 12 standards, 3 were in the Atlantic, 1 was at port back in the USA being worked on, and 8 were in Pearl Harbor, including Pennsylvania and Arizona. These were World War I era battleships. However, the U.S. did not build battleships for nearly 2 decades because of the Washington Treaty, then the London Treaty, the treaty system. They did have the South Dakotas, which were new, and they were starting to work on what would become the Iowas. But even though it might seem odd for a 25-year-old ship, it was still a good ship. These emphasized working together, armor, efficiency, durability over speed, and kind of flashiness. So they actually aged okay, but the problem is they couldn't keep up with the newer aircraft carriers. So when the Japanese attacked, nearly all 8 there took damage. These were the primary targets. Japan, battleships were always kind of the icon of a navy, so they went with them with prejudice. Of the 8, 5 sunk. Arizona was the most tragic and went down the fastest because one of her magazines exploded. Oklahoma took quite a bit of damage, then capsized and went under. West Virginia, Maryland were also sunk. Nevada was beached so that she wouldn't sink. Also, 13 other ships cruisers, refuelers, whatnot, were either heavily damaged or sunk. So the naval cost at first seems very high, but appearances are deceiving. And I wish I could really go into depth here, but it wouldn't be too long. Of the standard battleships, all but 2 were salvaged. Arizona here was not salvageable, period. Oklahoma technically could have been salvaged, and plans were already underway to do so, but it was deemed essentially not worthwhile. West Virginia, though, Colorado, Nevada, they were all reworked and went into the fight again later in the war. Other ships that had just received damage, like Pennsylvania, her sister ship here, went into port at the end of the month and were already back in action by March of 1942. And as is famously known, and even the Japanese knew this going in, the carriers were not there, so they had 3 carriers, fleet carriers at the time. Those were left to do their thing, and well, we know how 1942 would proceed from there. Having their battleship fleet, at least temporarily, out of service forced the Americans to use their carriers in new ways, including the Doolittle raid in April of 1942. It also kind of gave more priority to what would become the Essex class carriers. It forced the Navy to change how it was doing things. Would it have changed anyway? Yes. But having the battleships out of commission kind of helped. It helped clear the dead weight. And it helped push them forward to show them what they could do with carriers and kind of newer types of warfare, including using cruisers and destroyers in new ways, submarines for that matter. And these were older battleships. Even if they had not been sunk, their utility, their use in World War II was limited. For example, even when they were being used in 1944 and 45, they were used for shore bombardment. Their guns were still good, even the 14-inch and certainly the 16 of the Colorados, but they just didn't have the speed to really keep up with the fleet. Plus, battleships were World War I tech. This was not the war for battleships, as Japan and its commitment to the Yamamoto would kind of illustrate. So it certainly was not the decisive, conclusive route that they had hoped for. Much to the contrary. It stirred the pot. And what's funny is, because if someone had done that to Japan, an unannounced attack when there was no state of war, they would have considered a slap in the face, a slight against their honor, and been justifiably outraged. So why they did not think America would not feel the same is a gross miscalculation of the American mentality and mindset. So the outcome of the Pearl Harbor attack, which began a little before 8 a.m. on December 7, U.S. time, and was over well before lunch. The Japanese lost 29 aircraft, at least to enemy fire. A couple more were lost to mechanical issues. And with them, they lost 55 crew. The Americans lost 2,403. Most were military, but some were civilians, including firefighters. And a majority of these were actually lost on Arizona here when her magazine exploded. Luckily, because it was Sunday and the ships were in port, many of them were not at all fully crewed, so the damage could have been much worse. This meant damage control was more difficult, but, on the other hand, casualties were light. And again, we're in shallow water, so even if they sank, it was pretty easy to refloat them. There were also about 1,300 injured reported in one very riled up country. Now, on the hardware end of things, the ships we talked about, America had anywhere between 160 and 180 aircraft lost, with another 150 or so damaged, plus the loss of other resources, and some buildings were bombed by the Aichis. But again, Japan didn't get the carriers, and strangely they did not go after the oil, the fuel depot at Pearl Harbor, which is odd because that was really Japan's main logistical reason for getting into World War II. Japan had been reliant on America for much of its oil in the 1930s, and in the beginning, even when hostilities were ramping up in China and America didn't like it, they didn't cut Japan off from their oil. But after the Japanese invaded the Dutch East Indies and all that, America did cut them off from oil. That's why they attacked when they did. But so it's strange they didn't go after the oil. They also did not go after the submarine pin, or much else in the way of, storage for supplies or logistics or anything. Very unusual, their targets. Again, they were so focused on the iconic battleships, they really didn't do damage to the targets that could have taken America longer to recover from. And let's be clear, Japan never thought they would defeat America and would invade America and have a total victory. They were hoping to draw America to the negotiating table and get favorable terms so they could do their thing in the far Pacific. They were not banking on a long war. They were hoping for 6 months, maybe less. That's why Midway was hopefully a decisive battle where they would finish what they started at Pearl Harbor and take out the carriers. But things did not work out that way, because they found out that much like with a family, you might squabble amongst yourselves, you might say horrible, hateful things to yourselves, but when an outsider comes in and judges you or attacks you, it's amazing how a family comes together. And America has always been like that. And I think it's a message to repeat right now at the end of 2020 with how nervous, scared, upset we all are about everything. It's been a rough year economically, living condition-wise, health-wise, and, oh God, politically. And so that's one big reason I wanted to talk about Pearl Harbor, to acknowledge the dead and the sacrifices made, and just to remind us all what it is to be an American, what our history is, what we paid for it in the past, how much it's cost us, and why we should never give up on it or throw it away. I think that's very important to remember right now. Well, I greatly appreciate you tuning in to this extended gun and model video. We have done videos on all of these before, the guns at least, on this channel, some of the models too. So if you're interested, you might find those in the playlist for more details. And if you like models or military hardware, you might check out my personal channel, Misha. I do those. I also do black box videos, and I do some gun videos and previews, and just more informal. And like I said at the beginning, there'll be an extended version of this video with more commentary over there. If you'd like to help support the channel, request a video topic even, go over and check out our Patreon page and our tier system. And if you can't do that, we understand because of how things are right now. Just liking, sharing, and subscribing is great too, and Jay and I both appreciate it. With that, this is Misha, and we'll both catch you very soon next time.